The world woke up today to yet another shocking escalation in the war in Ukraine. Reports confirm that Russia has launched one of its largest air attacks in months, unleashing waves of drones and missiles across multiple Ukrainian cities. Air raid sirens blared throughout the night as civilians scrambled to shelters, and once again the grim toll of war weighed heavily on a country already battered by relentless strikes. In the immediate aftermath, U.S. officials have confirmed that Donald Trump, returning to the forefront of American politics, is preparing to push forward a new package of sanctions against Moscow in direct response to what he is calling a massive and barbaric assault on Ukrainian sovereignty. This moment feels like history repeating itself. The words "sanctions on Russia" are not new to our ears. Throughout the last decade, both Democratic and Republican administrations have leaned on economic punishments as a tool to pressure the Kremlin. But the question many are asking tonight is whether Trump's new approach signals a harder line, a shift in U.S. foreign policy, or simply another chapter in the ongoing tug-of-war between Washington and Moscow. And just as important, will sanctions actually work this time, or are we watching another political move that has limited impact on the ground in Ukraine? To answer that, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. Russia's latest air offensive was not just a random attack, it was calculated. Ukrainian air defenses intercepted many incoming projectiles but not all. Residential buildings were hit, energy infrastructure targeted, and once again the message was clear. Russia intends to keep Ukraine under constant pressure, eroding morale, and testing the West's willingness to keep pouring resources into Kyiv's defense. And here is where Trump enters the stage. According to senior aides, he has been privately pressing lawmakers and foreign policy advisors to craft a sanctions package that goes beyond symbolic gestures. He wants to hit Russia harder in sectors that have so far proven resilient, especially energy exports, high-tech imports, and financial networks. But can Trump deliver? And more importantly, will these measures alter Vladimir Putin's calculus? We've seen before that sanctions often cut both ways. They strain Russia, yes, but they also disrupt global markets, drive up energy prices, and sometimes harden domestic support around Putin by fueling the Kremlin's narrative of a besieged Russia under Western attack. This is where the geopolitical stakes grow even larger. Europe, still reeling from inflation and energy shortages, has to walk a fine line between punishing Russia and keeping its own economies afloat. And Washington knows that pushing too aggressively could fracture the unity that NATO has struggled to maintain. At the same time, let's not underestimate the symbolic power of this moment. By responding swiftly with sanctions, Trump is signaling to both allies and adversaries that the U.S. is not sitting idly by while Russia escalates. He wants to show decisiveness, and that's key to his political narrative as he campaigns for 2025. Remember, Trump's relationship with Russia has always been a lightning rod in American politics. Critics accuse him of being too soft on Putin in the past, while supporters argue that his unpredictability actually kept Moscow in check. Now, by spearheading sanctions in the wake of a devastating attack, Trump positions himself as the defender of Ukraine's sovereignty and, more broadly, as a strongman willing to confront aggression. But let's dive deeper into what these sanctions could look like. Sources close to the administration in waiting have suggested that one area under discussion is a near-total ban on U.S. companies exporting critical technologies to Russia, particularly semiconductors and software crucial to Russia's military and aerospace sectors. Another potential measure could be freezing more of Russia's overseas assets and tightening restrictions on banks that still act as conduits for Russian money flows through countries like Turkey, the UAE, and even some in Asia. These are pressure points that previous sanctions only partially covered. Trump's plan, according to insiders, is to go further, cutting off loopholes that Russia has been exploiting for years. Of course, sanctions are not just about economics, they are about psychology and diplomacy. Each move sends a message not just to Russia but to China, Iran, North Korea, and any other state watching closely. If Washington fails to respond firmly, the lesson other powers may draw is that aggression pays. Conversely, if the sanctions bite hard, they might reinforce the idea that the U.S.-led system still has teeth. But sanctions also carry risks. They may push Russia even closer to China, accelerating the creation of an alternative financial system outside Western control. Already, Moscow and Beijing are expanding trade in yuan and rubles, bypassing the U.S. dollar. Could Trump's hardline sanctions actually strengthen that trend? It's a question policymakers cannot ignore. Let's not forget Ukraine itself. For Ukrainians, every new package of sanctions is welcomed but also bittersweet. Yes, punishing Russia matters, but sanctions don't stop missiles in midair. What Kyiv truly needs are more air defense systems, more ammunition, more political guarantees. That's why the Ukrainian government is pressing Washington and NATO not to just sanction, but to deliver. Trump's challenge will be balancing the optics of decisive action with the substance of real support. His critics will argue that sanctions alone are not enough, that they are a distraction from the harder decisions about military aid and direct commitments. His supporters will counter that sanctions are a vital part of a comprehensive strategy to strangle Russia's ability to sustain its war machine. As we move through this analysis, think about the broader question. Can economic warfare really succeed against a country as vast, resource-rich, and determined as Russia? History gives us mixed answers. Sanctions on Iran crippled its economy but did not topple its regime. Sanctions on North Korea have failed to stop its nuclear program. Even during the Cold War, economic isolation did not cause the Soviet Union's collapse overnight. It was a long, complex process involving internal weaknesses. So, are we expecting too much from sanctions in Ukraine's war? Or is this a necessary piece of the puzzle, one that buys time and space for Ukraine to survive and eventually push back? As tonight's story unfolds, we are left with a vivid image. Russian missiles streaking across Ukrainian skies, sirens blaring, and in Washington, the gears of policy turning once again toward sanctions. It's a reminder that in this conflict, military firepower and economic weapons are deeply intertwined. And with Trump preparing to reassert America's stance, the world is watching closely to see whether this move will shift the balance, or simply add another layer to an already volatile struggle. When we talk about sanctions, it's easy to reduce them to numbers on paper. Lists of banks, trade restrictions, or frozen assets. But behind each sanction lies a much bigger web of consequences, not just for Moscow and Kiev but for the entire global system. To understand what Trump's proposed sanctions could mean, we need to unpack the layers. How sanctions have evolved since the beginning of Russia's invasion, how Moscow has adapted, and what new measures might change, or fail to change, the battlefield. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the Western response was immediate and sweeping. Within weeks, the U.S., the European Union, the U.K., Canada, and other allies froze hundreds of billions in Russian reserves, banned high-tech exports, and cut off major Russian banks from the SWIFT system. These measures were unprecedented in scale, designed to shock Moscow into retreat. And yet, nearly 3 years later, Russia is still fighting, still launching massive airstrikes like the one we saw just this week. The question many ask is simple. Why haven't sanctions worked? Part of the answer is Russia's ability to adapt. The Kremlin shifted its trade networks eastward, finding new buyers for oil and gas in China, India, and parts of Africa. It built shadow fleets of tankers to move crude under the radar. It developed parallel import systems through Turkey, Central Asia, and the Gulf states, enabling it to keep acquiring banned goods like microchips and machine tools. Sanctions slowed Russia down, yes, but they did not break its economy. In fact, some analysts argue that sanctions may have backfired by forcing Russia to become more self-sufficient in key industries. This is the reality Trump faces as he pushes for new sanctions. He has to go beyond symbolic pressure and target the arteries still keeping Russia's war machine alive. That means going after secondary countries that facilitate Russian trade. It means tightening enforcement, not just announcing restrictions. It means convincing allies, many of whom are growing weary of the war, that more economic pain is worth enduring. And that's not an easy sell. Here's where the politics get interesting. Trump has often positioned himself as the master negotiator, someone who can strong-arm adversaries and allies alike into doing what he wants. He has criticized Europe repeatedly for relying too heavily on U.S. security guarantees while dragging their feet on real contributions. If Trump takes the White House again, these sanctions might not just be aimed at Moscow, they could also be a litmus test for NATO unity. Will Europe step up, or will cracks in the alliance widen? The United States alone can impose sanctions, yes, but the power of sanctions comes from collective action. A unilateral U.S. embargo might hurt Russia, but without European cooperation, especially when it comes to energy markets, Putin still has room to maneuver. This is why Trump's next moves will be watched closely not just in Moscow but in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris. If he can rally Europe behind tougher sanctions despite domestic political fatigue, it will mark a significant shift in the war's trajectory. If he fails, Putin will see it as yet another victory in the long game of dividing the West. Let's also talk about timing. Sanctions take time to bite. They don't stop missiles from falling tomorrow or next week. They erode economies over months, even years. That's why many Ukrainians, while welcoming stronger measures, remain skeptical. For them, the immediate concern is survival, protecting power grids, hospitals, schools, and cities from relentless bombardment. And while sanctions may weaken Russia's capacity in the long run, Kyiv urgently needs Patriot systems, F-16s, artillery shells, hardware, not just economic punishments. Trump's challenge will be managing expectations, making it clear that sanctions are one tool among many, not a silver bullet. But let's not dismiss sanctions entirely. They may not collapse Russia overnight, but they do create constraints. For example, Western export bans on advanced semiconductors have already forced Moscow to scavenge chips from household appliances to build weapons. Russia's aviation industry is struggling to maintain fleets without access to spare parts. Its financial system, while still functioning, is more isolated than ever before. These are slow, grinding effects, but they matter. They reduce Russia's ability to wage prolonged high-tech warfare. And if Trump's new sanctions close more loopholes, that pressure could intensify. Now, consider the global ripple effects. Every new sanction package sends shockwaves through markets. Oil prices spike, grain exports fluctuate, inflation rises in countries far removed from the battlefield. This is why sanctions are not just about punishing Russia, they are about managing global stability. If Trump goes too far, he risks destabilizing economies in Europe, Asia, and even the U.S. itself. Gasoline prices, food costs, supply chain disruptions. All of these can become political liabilities at home. And Trump knows that his electoral success depends not only on looking strong abroad but on keeping Americans comfortable at home. The balancing act is delicate. Project toughness against Moscow without causing economic pain in Milwaukee, Dallas, or Phoenix. There's also the question of Russia's countermeasures. Putin has proven adept at turning sanctions into propaganda. Each Western measure is portrayed as proof that Russia is under siege, rallying nationalist sentiment and justifying further crackdowns. Moreover, Moscow has leverage too. It can cut gas supplies, disrupt global energy flows, and exploit relationships with countries outside the Western orbit to blunt the impact of sanctions. In some ways, sanctions are like a chess game. Each move triggers a countermove, and the board becomes increasingly complex. This is why Trump's messaging matters just as much as the measures themselves. If he frames sanctions purely as punishment, he risks reinforcing Russia's siege narrative. If he frames them as part of a broader strategy to defend international law and protect civilians from indiscriminate bombing, he has a stronger chance of rallying global support. The words chosen in Washington echo far beyond the Beltway. They shape perceptions in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where many countries remain skeptical of Western policies. Let's pause here and reflect. For viewers watching this unfold, do you believe sanctions are enough to pressure Russia into changing course? Or do you think they are more about political optics than real change? This is not a simple yes or no question. It cuts to the heart of how modern conflicts are fought. Wars today are not just about tanks and missiles. They are about currencies, trade routes, technology flows, and information. In many ways, sanctions are the 21st century equivalent of blockades. The question is whether they are effective against a state like Russia, which has deep resources and powerful friends. What happens if sanctions fail? If Russia weathers the storm, continues its missile barrages, and even expands its influence, what then? Will Trump escalate to other measures, perhaps secondary sanctions on China or India for buying Russian oil? That would be a dramatic move, one that could trigger even bigger geopolitical realignments. Imagine Washington sanctioning Beijing at the same time tensions over Taiwan are rising. The consequences would be enormous, not just for Russia but for the entire global order. This is why tonight's story matters so much. It's not just about sanctions, it's about the future shape of international relations. Will the U.S. under Trump be able to wield economic power effectively, or will it backfire, pushing adversaries together and straining alliances? Will sanctions hasten the end of the war in Ukraine, or will they prolong it by entrenching divisions? These are the questions that keep policymakers awake at night, and they are the questions we must grapple with as this crisis continues to unfold. So, as we leave this segment, the image is stark. Ukrainian cities under fire, Washington debating sanctions, Europe holding its breath, and Moscow calculating its next move. The pieces are in motion and the stakes could not be higher. International reaction to Russia's massive air assault and Trump's call for new sanctions has been swift, but far from uniform. In Europe, NATO leaders issued strong condemnations, emphasizing solidarity with Ukraine and underscoring the need to hold Moscow accountable. Yet beneath the surface, cracks are emerging, cracks that Putin has always been adept at exploiting. While nations like Poland, the Baltic states, and the UK push for maximum pressure on Russia, others, most notably Hungary, Slovakia, and even some voices in Germany and France, express concern about sanction fatigue. The longer this war drags on, the harder it becomes for Western governments to maintain unity in both policy and public opinion. For Trump, this represents both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, he needs European partners to make sanctions bite. On the other, he has never hesitated to criticize NATO allies for what he perceives as freeloading or weakness. In fact, Trump may leverage this moment to reshape NATO's economic strategy, pressing allies to align more tightly with U.S. sanctions or risk losing Washington's political goodwill. This could create tension within the alliance, but it could also force Europe to take a firmer stance, especially if Trump frames the choice as one between unity and irrelevance. Beyond NATO, the ripple effects stretch further. In Asia, Japan and South Korea expressed alarm at Russia's escalation, aware that a distracted or weakened West could embolden other authoritarian regimes, most notably North Korea and China. Tokyo has already been one of the strongest Asian supporters of sanctions, but it walks a delicate line, balancing its economic interests with its strategic dependence on U.S. security guarantees. Beijing, meanwhile, is watching closely. For China, Russia's endurance under sanctions is more than a regional concern, it's a test case. If Moscow can survive Western economic punishment, Beijing may calculate that it too can weather sanctions in a future crisis, perhaps over Taiwan. This makes Trump's sanctions not just a matter of punishing Russia, but of deterring China. Let's not forget the global South. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia often view Western sanctions with skepticism, seeing them as tools of geopolitical dominance rather than instruments of justice. Many of these nations continue to trade with Russia, buying discounted oil and grain that help stabilize their economies. When Trump pushes for tougher sanctions, he risks alienating these regions further, reinforcing narratives that the West prioritizes its own security while neglecting the needs of the developing world. The battle, therefore, is not only about enforcing sanctions but also about winning the narrative war. Can Washington convince neutral or skeptical countries that sanctions are about defending international law and protecting civilians, rather than advancing Western interests? And this brings us to the United Nations. Once a central forum for addressing global crises, the UN has been paralyzed by Russia's veto power in the Security Council. Still, debates in New York serve as a barometer of international opinion. After the latest attack, several Western diplomats pushed for emergency discussions, but Russia predictably blocked any resolution that condemned its actions. This stalemate highlights the limits of traditional diplomacy and the growing reliance on unilateral or bloc-led measures like sanctions. Trump's challenge will be to show that even without UN consensus, US-led coalitions can impose real costs on aggressors. But here's the irony. Sanctions often reveal as much about those imposing them as those being targeted. For the West, they demonstrate unity, resolve, and moral clarity, or at least that's the goal. For Russia, they are spun as proof of Western hostility. For the rest of the world, they can appear as heavy-handed, a reminder of how much influence Washington still wields over global finance and trade. This duality makes sanctions both powerful and problematic. Let's consider NATO's internal dynamics more closely. The alliance has spent decades preparing for conventional military threats, but it now finds itself navigating economic warfare as well. Sanctions have become a form of collective defense, a way of projecting power without deploying troops. But not all members are equally exposed. Eastern European nations see sanctions as existential. They know that if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, they could be next. Western European nations, while supportive, are more cautious, mindful of domestic backlash if sanctions drive up energy costs or trigger recessions. Trump's ability to keep NATO aligned will depend not only on his personal diplomacy but also on how he frames the costs of sanctions. Will he emphasize the price of inaction, a stronger Russia emboldened to test NATO's borders? Or will he focus on the benefits of action, portraying sanctions as an investment in long-term security? Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky continues his relentless campaign to rally support. In his nightly addresses, he has called the latest attack another act of terror, and urged Western leaders to respond with both sanctions and weapons. Zelensky knows that sanctions alone won't stop missiles, but he also understands their symbolic value. Each sanction package is another signal that Russia's aggression is unacceptable, that Ukraine is not alone. His challenge is keeping the West engaged as the war drags on, especially when domestic politics in both Europe and the US are increasingly consumed by internal divisions. This leads us to the heart of the matter. Sanctions are not just economic, they are political tools. They send signals, shape perceptions, and influence alliances. And in today's interconnected world, they also expose vulnerabilities in the West's own systems. Take, for example, the role of global finance. By weaponizing access to the dollar, Washington strengthens its leverage but also accelerates efforts by Russia, China, and others to build alternatives. Every sanction package risks nudging the world closer to a multipolar financial system, one less dependent on U.S. dominance. This is the paradox Trump faces. The stronger the sanctions, the more incentive adversaries have to create parallel structures that erode America's long-term power. But let's not overlook the domestic political theater in the United States. For Trump, sanctions are not just foreign policy, they are campaign strategy. By calling for new measures in response to Russia's air attack, he positions himself as decisive, strong, and unafraid to confront aggression. He draws a sharp contrast with Joe Biden, whom he portrays as hesitant or ineffective. In the eyes of Trump's supporters, sanctions are proof that he will not allow America to be pushed around, that he is willing to act where others merely talk. Yet critics argue that his approach oversimplifies complex realities, reducing geopolitics to slogans and creating risks of escalation. The debate is not just about Russia, it's about the kind of America voters want on the world stage, cautious and diplomatic or bold and confrontational. And here's a question for you, the viewer. Where do you stand? Do you believe sanctions are an effective way to check Russian aggression, or do you think they are more symbolic than substantive? Do you believe Trump's approach will unite the West, or risk dividing it further? These are not hypothetical questions. They are the choices shaping real policies, policies that affect not only Ukraine but the entire global order. As we close this segment, the image is clear. NATO leaders debating strategy, European economies under pressure, Asian powers calculating risks, and Trump preparing to reshape America's approach to economic warfare. Russia's missiles may fall on Ukrainian cities, but the aftershocks are felt everywhere, from Washington to Brussels, from Beijing to New Delhi. The battlefield is not just in Ukraine. It is in boardrooms, parliaments, and markets across the globe. And in this battle of endurance, the question is not simply who has more firepower, but who has more resilience. The sanctions debate reaches its sharpest point when we confront a fundamental question. Can economic punishment truly change the behavior of a nation like Russia, especially under Vladimir Putin's leadership? This is not just a matter of policy, it's a test of belief in the very tools that the West has relied on for decades. History provides a mixed record. Sanctions have succeeded in some cases, like pressuring apartheid South Africa or weakening Iran's economy ahead of the nuclear deal. But they have also failed to break regimes in places like Cuba or North Korea. Authoritarian governments often find ways to shift the burden onto their citizens, rallying nationalist sentiment against foreign enemies, while shielding elites from the worst effects. For Russia, the war in Ukraine has become existential. Putin frames it as a defense of Russian sovereignty, a stand against Western encroachment. Under that narrative, sanctions become less about economics and more about identity. They are evidence in his telling that the West wants to strangle Russia. That message resonates with many ordinary Russians, even those who quietly suffer under rising prices and shortages. This is why Trump's proposed sanctions must be judged not only by their immediate economic impact, but also by their political messaging. Will they weaken Putin's grip, or will they harden it? Will they encourage Russian elites to reconsider their loyalty, or will they bind them more tightly to the Kremlin out of fear of retribution? These questions are as crucial as any balance sheet. At the same time, we cannot ignore the humanitarian dimension. Every sanction package carries unintended consequences, often for the very civilians the West claims to support. When Russia is cut off from Western banking systems, it complicates food imports. When energy companies are sanctioned, global markets tighten, and poorer nations pay the price. Critics argue that sanctions can be blunt instruments, punishing ordinary people while political elites adapt. Supporters counter that allowing aggression to go unpunished sets a far more dangerous precedent. Between these poles lies the uncomfortable truth. Sanctions are rarely clean or cost-free. They are messy, imperfect, and often painful. But for many leaders, including Trump, they are preferable to the alternatives: direct military confrontation or doing nothing at all. The stakes extend far beyond Russia and Ukraine. Consider China, which is carefully analyzing every sanction the U.S. imposes. Beijing understands that its future confrontation with the West, most likely over Taiwan, will involve economic warfare at least as much as military maneuvers. Every sanction on Russia is a rehearsal for how the world might respond to Chinese aggression. If sanctions are seen as effective, China may tread more cautiously. If they are seen as toothless, Beijing may conclude that the West lacks the leverage to deter it. Trump's sanctions, therefore, are not only about punishing Russia, They are about sending a signal to China, shaping Beijing's calculations long before any Taiwan crisis erupts. This global chess game is why the timing of sanctions matters so much. Russia's latest air attack on Ukraine was designed to break morale, to show that despite sanctions, Moscow can still project power. By responding quickly and decisively, Trump hopes to reverse that message, showing that every escalation carries a cost. But sanctions work slowly, often over months or years. Missiles, by contrast, explode in seconds. This asymmetry makes it difficult for leaders to convince their publics that sanctions are working. Patience wears thin, especially in democratic societies where elections loom. Authoritarians can wait out sanctions. Democracies must answer to impatient voters. This dynamic gives Trump both an advantage and a challenge. He can argue that Biden has failed to act strongly enough, but if elected, he must deliver visible results quickly. Otherwise, his critics will accuse him of overpromising and under-delivering. And yet, Trump thrives in moments of confrontation. His political persona is built on strength, on the image of a leader who does not flinch. By calling for new sanctions, he aligns himself with a tradition of American toughness while also distinguishing himself from Biden. But this raises another question. What happens if sanctions fail? If Russia continues its assault, if Putin remains defiant, if Ukraine's suffering deepens, will Trump escalate further? Will he push for secondary sanctions on countries that continue to trade with Russia, including giants like India or Turkey? Will he risk a trade war with China in the name of punishing Moscow? Each of these steps carries enormous risks, risks that could spiral into broader conflicts. Sanctions may begin as economic measures, but they can end in geopolitical crises. For Ukraine, the calculus is immediate. Sanctions alone will not stop Russian missiles, but they buy time, weaken Russia's economy, and signal that the world is watching. For Zelensky and his government, every sanction package is both practical and symbolic. Practical because it cuts into Russia's resources, symbolic because it reassures Ukrainians that they are not forgotten. Without that reassurance, morale could collapse and with it, the will to fight. Sanctions are not only about Russia, they are about sustaining Ukraine's resilience. Now let's take a step back. Imagine the world 5 years from now. If sanctions succeed, Russia may be weakened, its economy isolated, its military exhausted. Ukraine, though scarred, may emerge as a symbol of resistance, integrated more deeply into Europe. NATO may be stronger, more united, more prepared for the challenges of the 21st century. Trump, in that scenario, could claim credit for having imposed the decisive measures that tipped the balance. But if sanctions fail, the picture is darker. Russia could solidify control over Ukrainian territory, emboldened by the failure of Western pressure. China could take note and accelerate its own ambitions. NATO could fracture under the strain of disagreement, while the global South turns further away from Western leadership. Trump, in that scenario, would face accusations of miscalculation, of relying too heavily on tools that were never sufficient. The consequences of that failure would not be confined to Eastern Europe, they would reshape the global order. And so we return to the central tension. Sanctions are both powerful and limited. They can wound but not necessarily kill. They can pressure but not compel. They are most effective when paired with diplomacy, military support, and clear strategy. Alone they risk becoming gestures. But combined with other tools they can shift the balance. Trump's vision appears to be one of maximum pressure, betting that economic strain will eventually force Moscow to recalculate. Whether that bet pays off remains uncertain. This brings us to you, the viewer. Do you believe sanctions can truly change the course of this war? Do you think Trump's strategy is the right one, or do you fear it could backfire? Should the U.S. focus more on direct military aid, or should it lean harder on economic warfare? These are not abstract questions. They are choices shaping the lives of millions, choices that will determine whether the world moves toward peace or deeper conflict. As we close, let's remember the images that started this story, the aftermath of Russia's massive air attack on Ukraine, the smoke rising from shattered cities, the grief etched on faces of families who lost everything. Behind every sanction debate, behind every speech by Trump or Biden, behind every NATO statement, are real human beings caught in the crossfire of geopolitics. That is why these choices matter. That is why we cannot look away. So if you found this analysis valuable, let me ask you, what do you think? Should Trump's proposed sanctions be supported? Will they be enough to change Russia's course, or are they just another chapter in a long and painful war? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if you want to stay updated on the most important stories shaping our world. Because in the end, the question isn't only about sanctions or strategy. It's about what kind of world we want to live in. A world where aggression is met with silence, or a world where nations stand together to defend the principles that keep us all safe.